This is a natural progression of how to protect your borders. And the other advantage is that it's cheaper. It's already there. So I can see that as demands on the defense budgets go up and up and up, that warWilding will become more and more prominent because it's a cash win-win situation for the beleaguered defense budgets.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World, and I'm very excited to be sitting here with Jasper Humphreys to talk about warWilding. Jasper is the Director of Programs at the Marjan Conflict, Biodiversity and Military Sustainability Study Group in the Department of War Studies at King's College in London. And one of the key areas of his research is the warWilding project. In other words, can we rewild strategically in order to make countries more secure? And there's been some amazing stories emerging from Eastern Europe and in the riven with conflict areas around Ukraine, where wetlands and wild landscapes have ended up defending communities from invasion. Jasper, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to me today.
Well, delighted, of course, Ben. Yeah.
Jasper, what's happened in Ukraine where we've picked up bits and pieces here in Britain around wetlands and peat bogs and the activities of resurgent beaver populations, which have ended up stymieing attempted Russian invasions of Ukraine?
Well, they've got two names. One is the River Irpin, which they call the Hero River, and then they've got the beavers, which they call the Hero Beavers, because they've played a large part. It is actually quite unbelievable. But I mean, cast your mind back to February 22, when the Russians invaded. They sent paratroopers into the airport outside, just to the west of Kiev. The tanks are rolling through. The columns are crashing through. Ukraine was very underprepared. It looked like curtains for absolutely for Ukraine, and the Russian columns were about 50 kilometers from Kiev, and then there was a desperate last roll of the dice by the Ukrainians, because the Russian columns went through a floodplain which had been dammed up further up the river, on the River Irpin, which provided the drinking water for Kiev. And the last desperate gamble is that they smashed the dam and they flooded the old floodplain, and they literally stopped the Russian columns in their tracks, literally. And it completely saved Kiev. Without it, it's highly likely that the Russians will be in Kiev as we speak. So that River Irpin was called the Hero River.
And that's because the heavy armaments simply got stuck in the mud. They just couldn't cross.
When I say in their tracks, they really were stuck in their tracks. And you can see there are lots of photographs of abandoned tanks and half tracks and all sorts of things. It was a complete game changer. Unbelievable. I mean, it's quite rare in stories of war that one particular small incident, I know we have battles and whatever, but small incidents like that can completely change the course of history. It really did. It's quite amazing.
And Jasper, tell me about the Hero Beavers, because we also read quite a bit about that during the early days of that war.
Absolutely. Well, there's on the northern Ukrainian border with Belarus, people would know it from Chernobyl, is a huge wetland area called the Pripyat Marshes, and it's vast area. And this has historically, over hundreds of years, proved a major barrier for all sorts of. We're talking Napoleon, we're talking the Wehrmacht in the Second World War, and it also happily contains lots and lots of beavers. And the beavers do what beavers do. They gnaw down the wood, and they make the place completely impassable for anyone to do anything whatsoever. One of the side effects of the war in regards to the beavers is that in the past people tended to break up the beaver lodges and kick them out because they flooded people's land with the dams and the lodges and so forth, so they didn't really want them around. But thanks to the war, in an inverted way, the people aren't around. They're either on the front line or not available for various reasons, and the beavers are expanding and having a much better time altogether. And as it happens, the Ukrainian forces have named their biggest drone the Bober, which is beaver in Ukrainian, and it's very effective.
It's just an extraordinary story how wild, wet nature has defended the country in this way. And governments across Europe and around the world have been discussing this big idea of conflict warWilding, creating defense lines for natural protection using nature, such as rewetting peatlands or expanding these river floodplains by demolishing dams or planting woods in special ways or tactically integrating existing topography for war fighting, woods for overhead cover, for example, as we saw in those amazing Second World War films that we all grew up with. And I guess the third that you've talked about is a strategic understanding of how natural elements, rivers, woods, and so on, can genuinely determine warfighting outcomes. So to what extent do you think we'll see this idea of conflict warWilding embedded into the defensive preparations of nation states in Europe and elsewhere in the world? I mean, are there countries actually doing this now?
Yep. The major one is Poland, because, of course, they've got a huge border with Russia and they've got vast forests and peatlands on their western way. And in fact, they call it the Eastern Shield. And they've been re-wetting peatlands. That's an obvious thing to do. They're also looking now, they've done feasibility studies into wider application of integrating nature. The German army have done the same. They're not quite so advanced. NATO had a conference a couple of years ago where they drew military figures, ecologists together to go into the idea. So it's very much on the table, because you have to bear in mind that here in Britain, we don't have Russia, 1,000 miles of Russian border on our doorstep. So it's a very different kettle of fish. And of course, we all know that all the economies are strapped for cash with all that. So this is a natural progression of how to protect your borders. And the other advantage is that it's cheaper. It's already there. Rivers, woodlands, whatever, or just with a little bit of a correct help and engineering and whatnot, it's all there waiting on the doorstep. So I can see that as demands on the defense budgets go up and up and up, that warWilding will become more and more prominent, because it's a cash win-win situation for the beleaguered defense budgets.
So we're potentially talking about really quite big areas of land being restored to peatland or wetland or forest to create these kind of natural and very cost-effective defensive lines, especially in Eastern Europe. But how does that work where you've got private land ownership? I mean, if I'm a farmer somewhere in kind of Eastern Poland, aren't I going to be pretty pissed off if they try and rewild my land or re-wet my land? I mean, obviously national security considerations trump conservation-only outcomes, and rewilding the Somerset levels, re-wetting parts of the fens and so on is pretty hard going in this country. If you threw a national security element into it, it might make it easier. But nevertheless, I can't imagine farmers greet this with open arms, Jasper.
Yeah, well, we could have the Dad's Army in the Somerset levels for you there, Ben. No, actually, you raise a very good point, because this has come up actually in the Irpin, the flooded floodplain, the Hera River, because they want to keep it. It's still flooded. But quite a lot of people had built summer houses there, because it's only 50 kilometers from Kiev. It's a very nice part of the world. People had either built summer houses, half built, or actually taken out plots of land and this, that, and the other. So they've lost them, and they want to get their houses back. So there's a battle going on between the government, who want to keep the flood in it, and the house owners either getting their houses back or their lands or getting compensation. But of course, Ukraine isn't flush with cash at the moment. So there is a battle between the two. And that is a sort of harbinger of the potential problems of that if you want to flood large areas of peatland, whatever, that is going to be an issue which has to be worked through.
And what are the other counterfactuals? It seems such an obvious thing, but obviously I'm deeply obsessed with the idea of rewilding. And so the more acres that get restored, the better for whatever reason. And if you throw in national defence as a consideration, then what's not to like? But presumably there are some voices within these Eastern European governments and within Ukraine who have arguments against the idea of rewilding farmland to create these natural defensive lines. What are those arguments?
Well, they're from two sides. One, for some ecologists believe that this is the thin end of the wedge, and that soft rewilding, i.e. using rivers and woods and whatever, will gradually morph into hard borders. Suddenly there will be concrete towers and minefields and so on and so forth. So they're a bit apprehensive. There's not all, but some. And of course the military, they sort of feel, well, this is not what military people do. We're paid to use tanks. As it happens, about 10 years ago, I went to a lecture by General Peter Wall, who was the head of the British Army at the time, and I popped in the warWilding question to him, and I said, "Why don't you do something similar to warWilding?" I actually approached about climate change. What was the British Army doing? And he looked at me rather fiercely and said, "We're paid to fight wars, not to save the world." And I get what he meant, and what he was playing, and that if the British government want the British Army to save the world, well, they're going to have to stump up the cash. But it sort of touched upon a problem that obviously the military figures have a military mindset. So it's the pushback is coming from two areas, but I'm sure the fiscal rules will triumph.
What about the idea that if you create these wild zones separating potentially hostile countries, it might end up hindering counterattacks, for example? So if Ukraine wanted to fight back and reclaim territory that's been taken by the Russians, won't their own columns end up getting caught up in the newly wilded and wet areas?
Yeah, that is always a problem. I mean, it's a sort of unknown problem, but I've talked to one or two people about this, and a couple of military figures about it. They say, well, as long as they're well known, they're well mapped, and they're laid out in proper strategic ways. There's ways that you can designate the way that the forests are lined, that you don't have huge, wide fire breaks, for instance, all that sort of thing. As long as then it shouldn't be too much of a problem. But yeah, they're on the paper, but done with care and with proper mapping, it can be sort of more or largely overcome.
Are there other examples of this kind of strategic conflict warWilding from history, as in way back?
Oh, lots. I mean, the masters of the Dutch, because of course they've got all these dikes and whatnot, and very sophisticated, as we know. And all the way throughout history, they've used the dikes either to their own advantage, or the invaders have used the dikes against the poor old Dutch. So, yeah, that's a classic example. Oh, think of our classic, the dam busters, smashing the Mona Dam and then unleashing that vast amount of water that flooded half the Ruhr. It's hailed as a great thing, but it wiped out thousands of people and villages. So it was very, very effective. I alluded earlier about the Pripyat marshes. That's a classic. I mean, there are so many armies have come a cropper on the Pripyat marshes. The Pripyat marshes are the corridor between northern Ukraine has always historically been a major battleground. Anyone with any slight knowledge of history knows that since time immemorial. But there's always been one big, huge mass, and that's the Pripyat marshes. And to go back to to Napoleon, and this is actually very interesting because it makes a counterfactual story. So he was faced by the marshes, and he's faced by the Russian forces, Brusilov, at the other side of the marshes. So Napoleon reckoned he had to split his forces, one to go to the north and one to go to the south, because they couldn't go through the marshes. And so Brusilov used this because he realized that now Napoleon was in a weakened position because half his forces were split. And so what he did carefully, he retreated very, very carefully, waging a delaying action, and it actually wore down Napoleon, and it was the precursor to Napoleon's doom. But it was the fact that he split his forces that actually was his major downfall. If you fast forward to the Second World War, the Wehrmacht, when they were going through, faced the same problem. But in true German style, they took it head on. And they barreled through, put their engineers through it, and it's full of mosquitoes and all sorts of things. And hundreds of engineers died of disease and all sorts of things in the height of the summer, of course. But they got the job done. They did lose hundreds of tanks that sunk, and it did work for the Germans because it did give them an opportunity. They came around the back of the Russian forces and bottled them up, and they got hundreds and thousands of the Russian prisoners. So it worked as both in the sense of going back to the Napoleon sense, it worked both to his advantage and against Napoleon and the Russian forces, Brusilov.
When we met at Canwood earlier this spring, you mentioned to me the earliest recorded incident, 2.5 millennia ago in what is today's Iraq. Tell me that story.
Well, yes, there were two of the ancient kingdoms they abutted the river Tigris, what is today the Tigris, and they were very advanced civilizations, we know, and they had canals diverting the water and so forth, and one of the fighters broke the walls of the canals and flooded his opponent. And that was the first recorded example that we have of the use of water or the use of nature in an offensive way altogether.
Jasper, we've talked a lot about conflict warWilding. In other words, the deliberate restoration of natural features to create a kind of defensive line. But when I think of warWilding, when you first mentioned this idea to me, I was thinking, Chernobyl. I was thinking the demilitarized zone between the two Koreas. I was thinking of these areas that are absolutely booming with wildlife, which obviously wasn't the intended purpose. Would you describe that kind of incidental restoration as warWilding?
I would, yeah, because I see warWilding. It's got three main elements. One is the fact that we've talked about is what you might broadly call strategic or defensive rewilding. Secondly, memorialization. Using letting abandoned villages and towns to rewild themselves as memorials, and there are a couple of examples of that. The one in France, Orador, Belchite in Spain, and also, of course, allowing wildlife to return, which is I'm very, very pro. Is not just a war strategy; it's also a strategy to bring back diversity as well.
So when we talk about the Korean demilitarized zone, that's an area that no one can enter because of the number of mines. It's one of the world's wildlife treasures, is it not?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about deliberate rewilding, for memorialization purposes, we're talking about commemorating war-destroyed ecology and communities by designating certain places specifically to rewild. So Oradour-sur-Glane, which you mentioned, commemorates a massacre of French inhabitants by the German SS division Das Reich. And in Belchite was a town that was completely destroyed in the Civil War. And then you mentioned to me Thiepval Wood in northern France. What was the story there?
Well, that was the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July the 1st, 1916. And the 36th Ulsters were sent over the top. They did very well. They got all their targets in the first day. Unfortunately for them, the people on either of their flanks didn't achieve there, and basically the Ulsters were isolated. So then they were told to slowly pull back, but then the Germans realized that the situation of the Ulsters and turned all the fire on them, and they lost 4,000 men in that day. They had set off from Thiepval Wood, and then they slowly returned back there, leaving their casualties and their dead and dying there. And today, the wood was replanted in the 1920s, and it is still just a wood. There's no other bill. And nearby is what they call the Ulster Tower, which is a typical tower in Ulster, which commemorates the 36 Ulsters altogether.
Jasper, you grew up on Salisbury Plain, which of course is largely owned by the Ministry of Defence. And it opens up an interesting idea, really, this conversation, as to the possibility for establishing really big wild areas by working with the Ministry of Defence, by the conservation movement working with the army. Now, I think the Ministry of Defence has got tens of thousands of acres, maybe 80 or 90,000 acres of Salisbury Plain, which could be, once again, a vast, unbroken Mesolithic grassland savanna with obviously the bustards that were reintroduced very successfully by the Bustard Group by David Waters, and who I must invite on this podcast one day, and also could be home again to wild horses, Przewalski horses or Kulan. I mean, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but it could be unbelievable. And the MOD has big chunks of land in Sussex and in Norfolk and all over the place. Do you see that possibility of the British military working on their training areas to go much further for nature than they have already?
Having grown up there from the 70s and taken an interest in what goes on there, and I've been on there and I've talked to some military figures who are in charge of all that. And I will say for the military that their thinking about the environmental impact and the possibilities has moved on a lot from the 70s, and they are very aware of it. Of course, they have to juggle the demands of training and this, that, and the other, but they are aware of it. And I do know what they do is, broadly speaking, they have different designations. So they have some core areas which are purely for military activity and nothing else can go on. Others are a sort of temperate, you might call it, areas where they allow the public leisure access, walk dogs and this sort of thing, but of course not during when they're live firing and all that sort of thing. And then the other area is actually, it is allowed, the public can walk around. I've walked around Tills Head and all this sort of area where it's just part of the Ministry of Defence land, but the public have got access. And that also, that sort of categorization also applies to farming on there. So I would say that they're aware of it, but it'll be interesting to see if you suggest beavers and cooling what the reaction is. Yeah.
I had Lieutenant General Richard Nugee.
Yep. I know him well.
At Canwood earlier this year, and he's a retired senior British Army officer. He was Chief of the Defence People, was his interesting title, from 2016 to 2020. But since he retired from the military, he's non-executive director for climate change and sustainability at the MOD. And he's really talking more and more about rewilding Ministry of Defence land. And he took a whole bunch of senior military personnel to see the NEP rewilding project last year. So I think there are, as you say, interesting things happening. And these Ministry of Defence lands could form very substantial core areas with very ambitious nature approaches if the MOD goes along with it. And I'm not too worried, I think, about the idea of military training activity harming nature, because we know that the tracks of the tanks create interesting breeding opportunities for things like natterjack toads on Salisbury Plain. And Charlie Burrell once introduced me to an ecologist whose name I forget, and she said that there's not a nature reserve in Britain that wouldn't be improved in ecological terms by having a few bombs dropped on it by the Royal Air Force. So I think disturbance is good, even military disturbance. And
as long as they get the right place.
Well, exactly, as long as they don't drop the bombs on neighbouring communities. So I think this is really exciting. The idea of the defence sector becoming a champion of rewilding for all the reasons we've discussed, whether it's rewilding their training areas or whether it's creating defensive lines at their country's borders, which is what's happening a lot in Estonia and Poland and Ukraine and so on, or whether it's rewilding landscapes inadvertently through creating buffer zones between countries or to memorialize military disaster sites. I think the rewilding movement could do well exploring this a lot more closely. Jasper, are you doing any of this? I mean, you're running this warWilding research program at King's College.
Yep.
Does that involve outreach? Are you taking this idea out to the world with a view to expanding it?
Well, we've hooked up with a charming guy called Boden Protz, and he's a professor in Lviv, and he's a beaver expert. He's also an expert on Chernobyl. He's spent a lot of time there. He knows everything about Chernobyl, and he knows everything about all the aspects. And he's a great fan of warWilding altogether. And he's, as you can imagine, he says beavers are the best engineers in the world. And maybe I don't know how the Royal Engineers take that, but we've hooked up with him because beavers move around quite a bit following, and he wants to see whether they can be asked to sort of stay in an area to do what they do, to beaverize an area and not leave it to beaver and then beaver off. Of course, that involves a lot of habitat because the beavers need to eat, so that you've got to integrate a good the habitat, and also not to be disturbed by the public to push them off. And he's actually applied for some EU funding, and I'm in the process of doing some applications as well. So that's our first proper toe into it. But I anticipate it. I think it's we'll get more. I think it, and I'm talking to other people in America and this, that, and the other too. And I'm looking to have a nice big conference next year at King's College.
Jasper, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast to talk about warWilding. It's a fascinating area, and we rewilding fanatics will take anything on offer when it comes to opportunities for expanding wild habitats. So this is very exciting. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ben. Thank you.
I find it fascinating that some of the wildest, most nature-rich places on the planet are that way because of some dreadful geopolitical event, war, for example. I found that conversation completely fascinating. I hope you did too. Please do think of sharing this podcast among your friends and colleagues. Spread the word. I'm truly grateful. Next time on Rewilding the World, I'm going to be talking to my friend Franz Scheppers, who is the founder and chief executive of possibly Europe's most important and impactful rewilding organisation, Rewilding Europe. It's just extraordinary the scale at which that organisation is working. I want to talk in particular with Franz about the impact of rewilding on wildfire and how rewetting landscapes and restoring herbivores is really a big part of the answer. I hope you'll join us.